So why did you do it then?
Sure. So what I saw unfolding was a slow moving train wreck that maybe in certain ways I was late to recognize. I certainly in by somewhere along the 6 month kind of process, I recognized that it was the president seeking to better position himself for a 2022 election campaign and attack his principal rival. He himself identified Vice President Biden, now President Biden, as his principal rival. So
But
at the time,
did that really jump out at you then? I mean, you're a lieutenant colonel, you're a pretty smart guy, but you were on the call to do what? And suddenly you were reporting your own president for misconduct.
Dana, that's actually not what ended up happening. What ended up happening is when Marie Yovanovitch, the ambassador, was removed, all it seemed like was that she was being attacked
to Ukraine.
Yeah, and it was unclear why, but that was in first March and then April. By May, it became absolutely clear that Rudy Giuliani may be acting on his own in support of his client at the time. That was unclear. Was casting a shadow over our relationship with Ukraine and saying nasty things about Yovanovitch. By the time we get to late May and June, and you start having specific effects on our policy, then that's actually when it became pretty troubling. When there was a hold on security assistance that emerged out of not anything that we really understood, out of OMB that doesn't really have a national security stake per se. They just they control the budget strings. And then by the time we get to early July, I started a process called I had been running a coordination effort with the entire government for months at that point, initially to put together a plan to help develop our strategy for Ukraine. But by the time we get to July, I went in a different direction. I went to try to figure out what was going on, why we had all these different threads coming together that were at odds with what the rest of the interagency, all the senior leaders, much more senior than me, thought was the right thing to do with Ukraine. So on July 10th,
hang on a minute, because there's a lot of people that don't follow this, right? So essentially, I mean, the U.S. at that point is trying to support Ukraine, that's defending itself from Russia and Russian-backed rebels, and suddenly military assistance, essentially, and training is being withheld by President Trump in the White House.
Well, that was actually not entirely clear either. Although, frankly, I had heard from OMB staff that this had come from the White House or from the president's chief of staff. I found it kind of hard to fathom that the president was going to do that. And I actually probably, didn't do myself a great deal of help by saying, well, I'm going to need more than just a staffer's word on this. So what I ended up doing is I ran this process up through the deputies for all the departments and agencies. Simultaneously, we had these calls coming together and these meetings with the Ukrainians. And on the July 10th, 2 weeks before, when the Ukrainian National Security Advisor was in town, one of President Trump's close politicals, Gordon Sondland, proposed this quid pro quo, as it's known, a investigation to the Bidens in return for a White House visit, and then kind of normalization of relations, including lifting the hold. And that he said, that this was troubling because this directly implicated the upcoming election. So that was the first time I reported something. But at the time, was
that a oh my God moment? But suspicions over months realized by a clear declaration that if you don't do us do the Trump White House a political favor here, we're not going to supply weapons in the national security interests of America.
Sure, so that's exactly how I treated it, and I went to talk to the senior officials in the senior legal officials. This simultaneously turned out that Fiona Hill, my boss, had a conversation with John Bolton, the president's national security advisor, and that's the one where he called it this whole thing a drug deal, the famous drug deal line. And then really by the time we get to the 25th, the only piece that was missing was whether President Trump was behind this or whether people were acting on his behalf, trying to ingratiate themselves. And the president went on the record and said, he wanted a favor from the Ukrainians, an investigation. And I followed through on like what I did before, my principled position about nobody being above the law, the president, trying to undermine what he had himself indicated was his policy when he signed the national security strategy a couple of years before, that laid out a way of thinking about these issues that we were operating within the context of, and then doing this to undermine election. So all this was pretty disturbing.
So anything seemed to go under Trump. I mean, and no red lines, no ethical red lines, and then maybe no legal red lines either. I mean, it is a presidency like no other, would you say?
I think that's right. I mean, I was just thinking this morning actually about Richard Nixon, who, in terms of he pales in comparison to, in certain regards. It's pretty vile attack on our democracy by spying on opposition party. But that's not where Donald Trump's kind of aims end. He's willing to undermine this nation. He's willing to drive a hyper partisanship that is tearing this country apart because he sees profit in it. I'm not even sure if he sees a second term. He sees profit in it. He could raise money off of it. And that to me is vile, as you pointed out.
So the January 6th committee, these revelations that Mark Meadows is getting the texts from, among others, Donald Trump Jr., from hosts at Fox News saying, look, that riot, I mean, you got to call it off. And he seems to stand back and watch it unfold with some glee. That's pretty horrific implication about the American president.
All right. Well, so he, he's been described by his niece as a narcissist and sociopath. So in that kind of context, it kind of makes sense. He's only concerned about his own interests, not about the interests of the country and what the implications are that our capital was attacked. And that's unfortunately who we elected once to president, and still has a decent following, I would say.
I guess Fox News wasn't a big fan of yours. I mean, I suppose they haven't been doing lengthy interviews with you.
I guess not. I mean, they seem to be afraid to ask the hard questions that you're willing to do.
So what do you make of the fact they're on there texting the president about his legacy and how they should behave? And would you, I would expect that I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe as well. Yeah. I would expect that in Russia, and I would expect it maybe in Ukraine and elsewhere. Yeah. I wouldn't expect it in one of the greatest democracies.
Yeah, it's interesting. In setting aside like the broader conversation about freedom of speech, and I believe in freedom of speech, there is a pernicious threat coming from a major news platform that is willing to say and do anything, completely unaccountable, at odds with the facts, and weave a narrative that is so destructive. I think, in order for President Trump to even get purchase with his ideas, he needed the ripe environment established by Fox News. And that's what's so harmful. That's why I think, I wrote a piece for Lawfare back in March of this year, I want to say, about litigation to pin back these most egregious efforts by Fox News. You hit them in their pocketbook when they lie. And just not enough people, because they're so large, not enough people are willing to hold them accountable. But that's exactly what's required.
Let's talk about Ukraine for a minute before I run out of time with you. Yeah. How would you assess what's going on right now with Russian troops, more than 100,000 of them on the border, while President Putin denies that there's any kind of invasion planned? And that's what he denied in 2014 when they went into Crimea. How serious do you think the situation is, and how should we be responding to it?
This is a very dangerous moment. I think it's a coin flip on whether this becomes the largest military offensive in Europe since World War II. I am actually leaning towards the fact that the only way this does get resolved is with some sort of military confrontation. And that's because Putin himself has also acted with impunity. The West has not countered a lot of his malign action and his use of the military as an instrument to achieve his political objectives. And now he thinks he could do the same. He perceives opportunity in a fractured West. I think I mentioned on one of the the programs that if we didn't have an insurrection in January, I don't think Putin would be considering this operation that he's getting ready to execute. I think he sees weakness internally in the U.S., distraction with a hyper focus on China, seams between the U.S. and our European allies, and then a deep need to act because he sees Ukraine slipping through his fingers. So it's the need and the opportunity that's driving this. And diplomacy is unlikely to resolve this because even if
then you're saying that President Biden failed in his phone call, in his video call with President Putin, because if you are leaning towards this is going to result in military confrontation, then President Biden's threats of nuclear style economic sanctions then just didn't cross the line.
I actually wrote a piece on this for New York Times. I think the call and that day as a kind of a point in time went textbook, but then the next day you had a gaffe by President Biden, in which he basically indicated that U.S. interests ended at NATO's borders. He didn't say that our legal obligations end at NATO's borders. He said our interests and our values end, and that's not a very good message to send to President Putin. I think what is going to be required, and we've had some kind of progress. It's been iterative. It's been inconsistent. The G7 statement from the foreign ministers has been solid piece of work. But we need to be more consistent. We need to be more synchronized. And the things that I think at minimum, there's more, but the things that are going to be important are that, sanctions, significant sanctions, impactful sanctions. I think we need to reassure our allies that NATO Article 5 holds, and that means posture changes in Europe. We probably need an out-of-cycle deployment, a large one to Europe, to indicate that this is what's going to happen if Russia invades. The U.S. is going to have to surge back forces to Europe. We need to arm the Ukrainians because although that's not going to be definitive, those tactical capabilities are not going to be definitive in changing the strategic perspectives or the strategic calculus of Putin. That's still going to be important in terms of changing the kind of some of the military calculus. So that's air defense. That's anti-armor.
No sympathy. No sympathy with President Putin when he says, give us guarantees that NATO expansion ends and then there is no military confrontation.
I don't think it's about NATO expansion. I think it's about Ukraine. NATO expansion is a factor in maybe some small way. And I think it's a secondary objective that he probably can do. Maybe these negotiations could be an off-ramp and face-saving measure. I talked about the pressure track. I mean, all the stuff that I laid out in the previous my previous point is one side of the equation. The other one is engagement. We do need to engage about mutual security concerns, mutual security risks. They're not unilateral. They're not Russia's concerns about NATO expansion. It's also about the militarization of Russia's western border that we need to talk about. So I think we need to have a holistic conversation. And sympathy, I'm not sure if I have that much sympathy for him. He's the one that has precipitated the militarization of NATO's flank by his military aggression.
Do you worry about an Article 5 situation where, okay, America is not going to pour troops into Ukraine and fight Russians that may push further into Ukraine, but you have some very passionate Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, who may physically come to the aid of Ukraine. And suddenly, if Russia attacks them, then you do have an Article 5 situation because they're members of NATO.
Well, the U.S. should be mindful of that. But I think, people talk, I think, about risks in terms of short-term immediate crisis risks. That's true. But we should also be a little bit more strategic in our calculation of risks. It's not just what's going on now. So there's crisis management going on now, but we also need to mitigate the medium and long-term risks. And if we back down here, all we actually do, and back down is not the right term. If we lack resolve in defending our values and our interests in this manner here, then we're increasing the probability of a major confrontation with Russia down the road, because this is not the end of Russia's aggression. It's not going to be like, okay, we've secured our interest in Ukraine, they're going to end there. They have other aspirations. They have aspirations for a bigger role in the international system. They have aspirations to upend the international system that hasn't served them. So all we're doing is we're buying down risk now and increasing it in the long term. We should be thoughtful of that, and we should be thinking about the spectrum of risk.